All right, today we're going to decode a piece of, well, what you could call resistance literature, something that literally could have gotten its author killed. We're talking about Revelation chapter 17. And look, this is way more than just a religious text. It's actually a coded political attack, an attack on the most powerful empire the world had ever seen. So our goal here is simple. We're going to crack that code. We're going to figure out the explosive message it had for its very first audience, the people living right under the shadow of Rome. Okay, so here's our game plan. First up, we're going to tackle why this text is so cryptic to begin with. What's with all this symbolism? Then we're going to get our hands dirty and actually crack that code, showing how Babylon is really a stand-in for imperial Rome. After that, we'll look at this absolutely stunning prophecy of collapse that's in the text. And finally, we'll zoom out and talk about the bigger picture, the themes of power, history, and faith that, honestly, make this ancient chapter still feel so relevant today. The very first thing that hits you when you read Revelation is just the style. It's so intense, right? It's just filled with these beasts and angels and all this completely bewildering imagery. Well, there's a name for this. It's a classic example of what scholars call apocalyptic literature. Basically, it's a genre that uses these really vivid, symbolic visions to give you a kind of heavenly perspective on what's happening on Earth, especially during a crisis. But that still leaves us with a big question. Why? Why write like this? The text just throws you right into the deep end of the symbolic world. An angel comes to the author, John, and says he's going to show him the judgment of a great prostitute who is seated on the many waters. Whoa, that's not subtle, right? This is classic allegory. You've got characters and events that are standing in for something else, for abstract ideas, or in this case, very real historical realities. And let's be clear, this is an incredibly politically charged metaphor. It's designed to immediately paint this picture of deep, deep corruption and massive global influence. And this really brings us to the key question, the one that basically unlocks this whole chapter. Think about it. In a world of Roman legions, of powerful emperors, of very real, tangible military might, why would an author use this kind of bizarre, almost fantasy novel language? Why not just come out and say what you mean?
Well, the answer really boils down to one word: survival. You have to remember, the author and his audience were living directly under the thumb of the Roman Empire. And this was a regime that had absolutely zero tolerance for dissent. If you wrote a pamphlet that just plainly said Rome is corrupt and it's gonna fall, that wouldn't just be brave, it would be an act of suicide. You'd be inviting immediate and incredibly brutal persecution. So this symbolism, it wasn't just some artsy stylistic choice, it was a shield. A necessary shield. It was a way to write resistance literature to critique the powers that be without getting yourself executed.
All right, so if this whole thing is a code, then let's get to cracking it. The absolute key to unlocking Revelation 17 is to figure out who the main players are behind all these symbols. And the number one antagonist, kind of the main villain of this story, is this figure called Babylon the Great. Now, for the original audience, these were largely Jewish Christians. That name, Babylon, was just loaded with meaning. It wasn't just a random city. To them, Babylon was the original evil empire. It was the power that had destroyed their sacred temple in Jerusalem and dragged their ancestors into exile hundreds of years before. So by using that name, the author is doing something brilliant. He's drawing a direct line, a parallel, saying, hey, the power that's oppressing us right now, it's just the new version of that same ancient evil. It's a code name for the corrupting, all-powerful, persecuting empire of their day. And then the author basically lays out a series of clues that would have been impossible for his audience to miss. It's like a checklist. First, the great city sits on 7 hills. Well, that was a famous nickname for Rome. Everyone knew that. Second, she's dressed in purple and scarlet, the official colors of Roman emperors and senators. And then, the most damning clue of all, she is drunk with the blood of the saints. That is a direct, chilling reference to Rome's very real persecution of early Christians. So for the people reading this back then, this wasn't some big mystery or puzzle. It was a crystal clear indictment.
So let's just break it down nice and clear. Every major symbol here has a direct, one-to-one historical counterpart. The prostitute, this great city, that's Rome itself. The cultural, political, and, in the author's view, corrupt heart of the empire. The beast she's riding, that's the Roman Empire as a whole, the terrifying military and political machine that gives the city all its power. And those many waters she's sitting on, the text actually tells us exactly what that means. It's all the peoples and crowds and nations and languages that Rome had conquered and now controlled.
Okay, so now that we know who's who, we can get to the real heart of the chapter. Its central prediction.
See, this isn't just a text that's critiquing Rome. It's actively prophesying its spectacular and incredibly violent downfall. And the way it's predicted to happen, well, that's what's so fascinating. You can imagine, for a community being persecuted, this offered a profound sense of hope and reassurance.
And this vision of collapse, it is shockingly brutal. The text predicts that the very parts of the empire that give it strength, the conquered kings and nations, symbolized by the horns on the beast, they are the ones who will turn on the city of Rome. And they don't just, walk away. No, the text says they will violently hate her. They'll make her desolate and naked. And then, in this incredibly graphic metaphor of total destruction, they will eat her flesh and burn her up with fire.
So the text basically lays out this three-stage process for how the empire eats itself. Stage 1, it starts with internal corruption. Think of the moral decay and the insane excess of emperors like Caligula or Nero that rots the whole system from the inside out. Stage 2, that decay leads to rebellion. The conquered nations, the vassal states that the empire depends on, they start to turn on their master. And stage 3, this all leads to total self-destruction. The key here is that the empire isn't conquered by some bigger, badder enemy. It's literally torn apart from within by the very pieces that once made it so strong.
And what is just astonishing is how accurate this prediction turned out to be. I mean, remember, this was written in the 1st century, but it perfectly describes a pattern of collapse that played out over the next 200 years, and even longer. The Western Roman Empire wasn't defeated by one single, massive external force. It crumbled from the inside, totally weakened by political chaos and economic collapse. And then, eventually, the city of Rome itself was sacked in 410 AD by the Visigoths, one of the very groups the empire had once conquered and controlled. It's just like the text said, the beast literally turned on its rider.
Okay, so this brings us to our final section, where we kind of zoom out. Because beyond just predicting what would happen to Rome, Revelation 17 raises these huge, timeless questions. Questions about the true nature of power, about the recurring patterns of history, and about that constant tension between the power of the state and a person's spiritual life. So you might be wondering, why does any of this matter to us, thousands of years later? Why bother studying this ancient critique of an empire that's long gone? Well, the text itself seems to suggest that what happened to Rome wasn't just a one-time thing. It's a pattern that repeats, almost like a law of political physics that just keeps playing out over and over again in human history. When you boil it down, the text is offering this timeless lesson about power. It's basically saying that empires tend to follow a predictable cycle. They're built through conquest, but they collapse because of their own corruption. It shines a light on that fundamental conflict between a government that demands your total loyalty and a personal faith that answers to something higher. But maybe its most radical claim is this: empires aren't ultimately destroyed by outside enemies. They're destroyed by the same greed and violence they used to build themselves in the first place. It's a powerful warning that if you really want to understand power, you can't ignore its dark side. And so let's just end on this thought. Revelation 17 is so much more than just an ancient angry letter about Rome. You can see it as this really sophisticated analysis of what you might call the pathology of empire. The core argument is that any system built on unchecked power, on excess, and on exploitation has the seeds of its own destruction built right into it. So if that's true, if this is a recurring pattern, a fundamental law of history, then what does this ancient coded critique of Rome have to tell us about the great powers and systems that shape our world right now?